Would anyone like to lead us in prayer this evening?
I can do that.
Great.
Gracious Father, as we come before you this wonderful day that you've given us, we ask that you guide us and lead us. Open up our minds to receive what has been said, what will be said. But more importantly, Father Jesus, let us know in all that we do, all that we go through, you're always going to be with us. So use our teacher in a mighty way. Bless all those that are online and bless those that wanted to be online that could not be online. But I pray the knowledge that we gained that we could be able to help someone else. In Jesus' name I pray, amen, and thank God.
Amen. And thank you, Mary, for that. I do always pray that something that I say is helpful to each of you in some way. And that's always my prayer. And that it would help us to minister to others as they go through grief too. So before we get started, do any of you have any questions, comments from any of the previous sessions? Anything that you'd like to say?
Well, I wanted to actually, every time I get off the line and we have our class, the Lord brings things to my mind. And one of the things that came to my mind was the Collins family. I don't know if y'all remember, it was a worldly news where the grandfather took his four grandkids up to the Centerville for camping, and they were all murdered. So it was four grandkids and a grandfather. But anyway, I saw this. I looked it up and because I remember so clearly, the dad who lost his dad, three of his son, and his nephew. He spoke at the church, and it was a huge church out in I guess west side of Texas. And he said this. He said, "Lord, I pray that they're okay." And then he said, instantly, the Lord told him, "They're okay. They're with me. They're doing just fine." And so the father went on to say, "We're going to be okay. We're going to be fine." And that just struck me as if someone had just opened up my eyes to know that God is real. How could you lose three sons, a nephew, and your dad, and still praise God? He said, God is still good. He ended by saying, God is still good. So that really just struck me as just awesome. I don't know if I could have done that, and the life has changed tremendously. But he spoke. He spoke with clarity. He spoke with boldness, and he meant every word he said. He says, "We're going to be okay."
That's an interesting thing. I do remember that happening. And I remember something about his response to that as well. And that's an example, I think, of faithfulness and a life of faith, and really truly believing that its own death is only that step over into another, into the presence of God, rather than into an eternal grave that is nothingness, really, which is what a lot of people truly believe. And so, that kind of faith is very significant and very important. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that he probably had lots of days of deep grief for his family and for all that was lost in that.
Well, I'm pretty sure of that, but I think that to get through it, he have to believe that they're okay. God said they're okay, and that's his faith walk. And they were a family of they had strong faith all during the years because they showed a lot of pictures and family gathering, and every day is not a happy day, but you have to trust God with every day, like we do. We haven't lost anybody, but we have to trust God with everything and everywhere we go, especially nowadays.
Yes, absolutely. Rhonda?
I was just going to say, when we lose someone, if we're a believer and they were a believer, we can take comfort in where they are, but that never means that we don't grieve because we've lost somebody.
Mhm.
we may know where they are, but that doesn't mean that we don't miss them and hurt because of that.
Yes, there is a void in our own lives from that, and that's what hurts. Is what happens to us personally. It's not necessarily what's happened to them. It's the loss that we feel and the love that we had for that person. And so that's what makes that grief so strong. But at the same time, we can have grief and we can have faith too. And that's what's important for us as people of faith. Well, you know, that's an interesting story, Mary, because what we want to talk about tonight is the family and how the family goes through grief together and some of the dynamics that exist within a family when they lose someone. Primarily, when we are ministering to someone, it may only be one person, but we still have to remember that when we deal with even just one person in their grief, there's an entire group of people who have been impacted by the death of that one person. And that's the family unit. And many times we tend to forget about the family itself being struck by grief and what can happen within a family as they go through that. You know, when one member of a family dies, the entire family unit is thrown out of balance. They had a certain way of relating to each other. They had certain roles that they fulfilled within the family. And suddenly that changes. And the entire balance of the family is disrupted. And this can happen even in a family where there is a diagnosis of an illness that is life-threatening or a terminal illness. That disruption happens even at that point. And each member of the family has a different response to the news, either the news of a terminal illness pending or the news of a death. Each person responds to that in a different way. Some respond with acceptance and empathy, providing help and assistance. Others in the same family may refuse to acknowledge the inevitable. And I've seen this happen time and again in my work when one member of the family will accept what's happening and understand that this is a terminal illness and it's going to end in death. And another member in the family refuses to admit it and refuses to come around and refuses to be a support for the rest of the family as they go through it because they just can't accept that. This all happens within one family. Each family member's grief is unique to that person, and that's something that we have to remember. Each responds to the death in a unique way. Even though they've been exposed to the same loss, or that's what we think. But have they really been exposed to the same loss? That's the question. Maybe, maybe not. First of all, you have to consider the uniqueness of each loss for each one of the people mourning within the family. It could have been a spouse, it could have been a parent, it could have been a sibling, it could have been a child that was lost, or as they respond to that loss. For instance, if the father is the one who is dying or has died, the wife is going to relate to that death in a different way than the children will, if there were children, or than the parent would. or even a brother or sister would. And so everybody relates to that differently. So have they really experienced the same loss? It might have been the same person for each of them that was lost, or maybe not. Not only the relationship to them, but also the quality of the relationship. Were they very close to that person, or were they more distant? Were they, had they maintained a good relationship, or had they had an estranged relationship? What was their relationship with the person who passed away? That also has some bearing on the person as well as the entire family unit together and how they relate to them. You also have to consider the roles that the deceased person had in that family. Were they the breadwinner? Were they the caregiver? What was their role in the family? And how did that impact the others in the family too? And sometimes there may have been positive or there may have been negative characteristics that the deceased person had that can impact how each one in the family viewed them. First of all, we want to consider how the family balance is affected. When a family member dies, that family unit in many ways dies with them. It changes, at least how it was previously known. It's now different and not necessarily in a good way. It throws off the balance, like I said, of the family. Something that affects one family member will affect them all. And that family system needs the support of each member to keep functioning. And there are lots of dynamics that are involved in that, some of them good and some of them bad, as they begin to re-identify their roles and reestablish the family system going forward. And a lot of times they may need some assistance in identifying the roles that need to be fulfilled now that that one member of the family has left the family unit, and those roles need to be reassigned. That's quite often one of the most difficult things to deal with at the time of death, particularly if arrangements were not made before the death, as to how those roles would be fulfilled again. But unless those roles are fulfilled, the family balance really can't be restored, and the family tends to lean toward chaos, particularly early on in the loss of the person. There is a lot of chaos, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of struggle that takes place within a family unit when a person has passed away within that family unit. And if you're the one who is called upon to help a family grieve, the first thing you might want to do is to just take note of the deceased person's position in the family. Who were they? What role did they fulfill for the family unit? To the spouse, it's the death of a spouse. To the child, it's the death of a parent. Or it could be the death of a sibling, or even a grandparent. All of those people may have a large effect upon the others that are left. We have to always keep in mind that each loss is unique and it requires a different approach. Have any of you had any experience with a family unit that has lost someone and you've seen them struggle through that, trying to reestablish the unit again? What would you say about that? Anyone?
When my ex-father-in-law passed, my mother-in-law, ex-mother-in-law, I don't really want to use the word worship, but that's the one that matches the situation. And when he passed after a long bout with colon cancer, that the whole family, my ex, his brother, my ex-mother-in-law, they were lost because the dad, the husband, he he ruled everything,
Yeah,
and they didn't
So-
know what to do.
right. So he was the one in control, and then everybody else was kind of lost when he was gone.
Yes.
Yeah. So somewhere they have to start building new roles and establish some kind of order again. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Mary?
Well, I was just thinking about my brother who passed away this year,
Mhm.
and he wanted so bad to see our older sister because she had not communicated with him in years, and they live right there in Chicago. And I wanted so bad to reach out to her, but I know it wouldn't go well. And I don't feel guilty. Well, sometimes I do feel guilty that I should have just say he wants to see you and leave the choice up to her. But she has this spirit that is so um, always the victim, you know. And they did me wrong. I don't want to have anything to do with them. So I never did tell her this, but I know she miss him. And sometimes I think maybe I should have said he really wants to see you and leave the choice up to her. But I wasn't strong enough to address that because I know her response would have been something that would have hurt me uh,
Yeah.
dearly because I couldn't go back to tell him what she said because he was already in a lot of pain, you know. So that does sometimes grieve my spirit that I should have said something. And I'm the one that I'm the go-to person, you know, out of
Mhm.
9 kids living in Texas, uh, everything is always on me. So I just continue to pray for strength to, you know, because I still grieve over my brother, and I'm sure she does.
Yes, I'm sure that she does in her own way. And you know, that's one of those tough situations. There's many times in my work when uh, and this is quite common in families, and when
Oh,
they're
really?
in which there may be one family member who is estranged from the rest of the family, and how to get them back together again, just for a reunion of sorts before someone passes away, is very difficult. And Mary, actually, I've had to do that before, in which I've called a family member and said that, you know, someone is sick and they are living out their last days and they would like to see you, and to have um, something, you know, to make amends, or to just reacquaint each other, just to see them, whatever the case may be. And it's easier for me to do that as a chaplain because they can take things out on me, and it's not like your sister taking something out on you. Um, I am kind of a third party, and so it's easier for me to do that than it would be for me to do that to my brother or sister, like you had to do with your sister. So those kinds of things are quite common in families. It happens a lot, but it still is an effect on the family unit as a whole. I'm sure that affects your family even now, just as it affects you. We also have to begin building those new roles and relationships. But before that can really take place, each person in the family needs some time and space to absorb that loss in their own way. And this hopefully happens in the very early stages of the death, in which they can be confronted with their grief, and they can grieve together, all of the family, hopefully together. But sometimes the family members are pulled between sympathy for the loss of the other family members and the demands of their own loss. You may sympathize with the others, but you also feel that loss deeply within yourself too. And you're trying to deal with that as well as to help others in the family deal with their loss too. It's a very difficult time to go to or go through. The family may have suffered a collective loss, but each one is the center of their own private tragedy too. And that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. There are two major tasks that the family has to go through in order to reach a point where they recover from this death. One is a shared acknowledgement and a shared experience. Every family member, no matter their age, must, in their own way, confront the reality of the death in the family. And that's harder for some than for others. It's especially hard on young children, but it can be hard on other people in the family as well. And that needs to begin, if possible, even before the death, if we're talking about a terminal illness. If there is a long-term illness involved, the family really needs to be visiting the dying person and finding ways even to include children in that as well, if the situation permits. I have a family right now that I'm working with. It's a grandmother and grandfather. The grandfather is terminally ill, but he and his wife raised the grandchildren for a number of years. While the parents were not involved. And so these children range in age from about 6 to 15. And they still come over now, even though the grandmother can't take care of the grandfather, who is the one who is terminally ill, and the children. So the children were taken back to their parents, or one of the parents anyway. But they still come over on the weekends. And this week she was asking me, the grandmother was asking me, should she have the children be involved in his life right now? And I said, by all means, absolutely. They should be if that's something that the grandfather wants. And he did. He wanted to see them. He wanted to have contact with them. And so she began to bring them over, even the little ones, the 5 and the 7-year-old, to see him and to have interactions with him too. Even though they have lots of questions, kids always have questions, and they're not afraid to ask them. But that's important to help them to recover from this as well. Many, many times families, and their intentions are good, but they want to protect the children by isolating them away from what's happening. And that truly does impede their grief process. It's hard for us to help them through that if they don't experience it with us. And so my recommendation always to families is to involve the children, let them be a part of the family unit that sees these things happening. It's really quite okay. So that's one of the things that the family has to do in order to recover, is to acknowledge and to share this experience together, not to hide it away from others. So even if a patient is in the hospital, they should be allowed to go and visit and to see them. We're ministering to the entire family, not just to the person who is sick. Rhonda?
That happened to me. My parents shielded me from family members and friends that had died. And my fear of the unknown I mean, that kept me afraid of death for years because all I knew was that it was something horrible that my parents didn't want me to see.
Yes, that's right. And thank you for sharing that, because that is something that that can haunt them for the rest of their lives.
It was an actual fear. I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know, what to expect. It's kind of like when you don't want to go into a dark room because you think something's in there.
Mhm. Yes,
It, it's just really scary.
yeah. And I get the fear. When my son-in-law passed away, and he was a young man, 38, when he passed away. Um, and he had a 2-year-old son. And I wanted to shield him from that as well. And it was a funeral with an open casket. And so he was too little to see inside the casket, but he didn't know what was going on. And someone else lifted him up and let him see his dad lying in the casket. And I didn't really want them to do that. But in reality, I think it was important for him. His reaction to it was, oh, daddy's asleep. And that gave us an opportunity to say, yes, daddy is asleep. And to explain a little bit about that, even to a 2-year-old. Now, did he understand everything we were saying? No, of course not. But he was able to share in that experience. And he may not even remember it, but he was still able to share in it. And it wasn't something that just struck fear into him, like sometimes we think it will with a child. In reality, they're not nearly as disturbed by things like that as we think they would be. So I think it's always a good idea to be open and to share, even with children, in that as well. Now, in order to recover, the family unit is going to have to identify the relationships that are existing in the family and kind of realign those roles, particularly when we're talking about the nuclear family, mother, father, children. Those things have to be reset again and reestablished in order for the family unit to continue to function well over time. The more influence or significance the deceased person had in the family creates an even greater imbalance, kind of like Rhonda was talking, where that one person had such a strong influence over the family. If it's a husband and father, for instance, that can leave a very significant gap in finances or in taking care of things in the house, depending on what his role was and what things he fulfilled for the family. If it's a wife and mother, that can leave a significant gap in other areas of life. Life is different in all families, of course, but those are just some generalizations that serve to illustrate how impactful a particular death might be within the family. And there are other roles too. Sometimes we don't think about some of the other roles that are established in a family, but quite often there's the role of the doer. There is a person in the family who provides all the maintenance functions that keeps things operating. And what happens when they're gone? Who picks that up and does it? There may also be a person that we call the enabler in the family, the one that provides emotional stability and a sense of belonging to others. And what happens when that person is gone and there's no one to bring that particular role into the family again? Sometimes there is the person in the family who we know as the loner, the one that brings the one in the family who is often forgotten or silent. We don't want to forget about those people either. Many families have a hero in the family, the one who brings recognition to the family through success or achievement. There are others in the family who provide relief for the family in the fact that they lighten up the atmosphere. They are the clowns of the family. There's also those in the family sometimes that are critics, and they are always finding fault with everybody else. That's the role that they provide in the family. Sometimes the family may have a scapegoat in the family, and they're the ones who are the family victim. There's also the saints of the family, the ones that express the family's spirituality and represent that to the family. Now, not all families have all of these functions, but these are things to consider, things to think about as you walk into a family unit where there is grief and watch what's going on. These are some of the things that you might see. And it's important for everyone to be allowed to express their grief in their own way, in the beginning, of course. If they're encouraged to share their grief, the family will heal in a healthier way. If not, their grief can be hindered. And we've talked about this already, but I want to reiterate that children are often the forgotten grievers in a family. Quite often, we pass over them. I see this happen a lot, even at funerals, in which the children just seem to be there, but not actively a part of the grief of the rest of the adults in the family. And we have to really watch that and to be willing to reach out to even those children and draw them into the comforting process as well. The greatest predictor of how a child recovers from grief is the functioning level of the surviving parent and how well they're functioning. And I don't mean that they're ignoring their grief, but they're functioning through their grief and they're processing through their grief in a healthy way. That will help those children to also process through that grief too. And keep in mind that a lot of children continue to connect with the deceased parent in many ways. Quite often they'll talk to them. They will feel like they're being watched by them, and that person is watching over them and protecting them. They will think about them. They will dream about them. And actually, they will try to locate them somewhere. I know my 2-year-old grandson, as he grew, he would often ask where Daddy was. Where is Daddy? He wanted to know a location and he wanted to locate him somewhere. And so that's something else that we have to deal with when we're talking about children. But children that are going through grief, they need support, they need nurturing. They need to know that they'll be cared for, that they will be loved. They need to know that the death was not caused by something they did or they didn't do. It was not caused by something they said. It was not caused because they were mad at the person who died at some point before the death. These things are things that the child needs to be assured of. They do need information about the death, but in an age-appropriate way. They do need to understand some things that had happened. They need to feel involved and important to the family. And they need to have a continued routine. They need to have numerous ways to remember the person who's died. Those are some of the needs that children have. And so these are things that we can help do as we minister to families that are going through a time of grief right now. So some guidelines to remember as we go through this. When a person dies, the entire family experiences upheaval. I know all of us who have had close family members who have died, and that's probably all of us. We know what that upheaval is like. We know the stress that it places on the family. We know that the patterns of relationships are disrupted. And that happens even outside the nuclear family of father, mother, children. It can happen even into in-laws and to cousins and to uncles, aunts. All of the family structure is affected by the death of that family member. Even when the person is older. My dad passed away in his 90s, and that still had a great effect on us as his children, on his, he was the last one of his siblings to die, but he was still close to many extended family members, nephews and nieces. It had a great effect on them as well. And while it doesn't cause as much imbalance as in the nuclear family, it still makes things shift, and it causes some amount of imbalance. It's kind of like the rippling of a rock thrown into a pool of water. The ones closest to it, the ripples are going to be bigger, and then they begin to dissipate as they go outward. Well, that's true within the family as well. Those people on the outside, the cousins, the nieces and nephews, they can still be affected, maybe just not as much. But in order to adjust, each member of the family has to adjust their roles and relationships in relation to the others in the family too. That gap has got to be filled, and it will be in one way or the other, or grief will be extended over a long period of time and won't be very healthy. So those roles need to be adjusted. The family adjusts to them and begins to fill those things, and there is help that comes in through that as well. During the first weeks of grief, as you're working with someone, the individual needs of the family may disrupt the family's ability to function successfully, but that's to be expected, and it can be worked with as the family can perhaps get some counseling or some help from others who can just be there to respond and to provide aid and help during that time. Remember too that each member of the family is going to see themselves as the center of the loss, because that's the way we are. We're going to feel our own loss first, and then we might relate to the others in their loss and reach out and comfort them too. But each one of us as individuals lives through our own private tragedy. And that's something else to keep in mind as we go through this and try to help out with others. There's a need for good balance between family togetherness and individual freedoms too. Each person needs to have the freedom to express their grief, but there also needs to be a shared form of that grief too, in which they are sharing their grief as a family, but also grieving independently as well. It's important to allow each person in the family to absorb that loss in their own way and on their own timeline. And also realize that the children, especially the eldest child in the family, may feel compelled to try and assume the role of the lost parent. And parents need to protect their children from taking an inappropriate amount of responsibility for things. I had someone tell my 7-year-old grandson that he needed to be the man of the family. No, that is not his responsibility. That is not his role in the family. You know, early in the last century, actually, many families experience the loss of a parent at a young age. And being in very large families, many times those families, the older child in the family actually did have to take over the mothering responsibilities of those who were younger in the family too. And sometimes that still happens even today. But that should be the exception, not the rule. And it's something that the family needs to come together to share those responsibilities and roles. Yes, Marissa, go ahead.
You mentioning that brought something to my attention. When my best friend passed, um, at her wake, her father, well, her younger sister, um, was crying hysterically, and I went to her and held her, and her father turned to me and said, "You know, Marissa, it's now your turn to step up and be the rock." And that was painful because I was also mourning my best friend who was like a sister to me, and B, I'm still a part of another family that still sees me as being significant and important and need things to get done in that family as well. So saying that to say, I can only imagine, you know, your 7-year-old grandson is young, so he may not be able to interpret it yet, but I can only imagine how that might have been perceived by, say, you or, you know, others. And I'm just curious, in scenarios like that, when it's so sensitive, how does one respond to that? Like, how did you or someone else respond to that being said?
About being a rock now?
Or your 7-year-old grandson being told it was his turn to be the man of the house.
Yes, yes. Well, what we expressed to him was that there is no one who could replace his father as the man of the house, and that he needed to continue to be who he was and fulfill whatever role he wanted to. Now, we didn't put it in those terms, but to continue to serve in the family and to be supportive and be loving and be kind, particularly to his younger brother, but not to worry about taking on all of the responsibilities. I mean, he couldn't get out and go to work. You know, we tried to explain that to him as well. And you can't do those kinds of things. You need to be who you are and to serve the family in your way and do what you need to do. You know, in so many families, and I hear this all the time, coming from various people in the family at a time of death and loss. And that is, I've got to be strong for my family. Like Marissa, you were told that it's now up to you to be the rock.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, that's not healthy at all.
yeah.
But people expect someone to hold everything together. And in reality, none of us are equipped to be that kind of person. We need to grieve. Now, and sometimes I encourage people to reply to them like, I am here to support and I'm here to give you
Mm.
my best, but I'm hurting. And that's okay. I'll hurt, and I'll be here to be a support. I'll hold her, but I'm gonna cry with her. I'm gonna have my own grief. I have to.
Yeah, I like that. I like the messaging. I like what you told your grandson, and that it's interesting when grief happens in the moment. It's so hard because you don't really know what to say, and that was tough. And I just remember being paralyzed with fear because my thought was, oh my God, I'm going to have to assume a role, and I, still have to work. I still, I had other obligations as well. And so, yeah, but that's good. I didn't even consider that, and that's just the truth, is just being honest and real and upfront about what I can do, because none of us are superhuman.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah,
It's a pressure that's too great to be put on one individual. And so often one individual does try to take that role on, and it's unhealthy because all of us need to share in the grief, not pour out that grief to just one person and expect that person to hold up everybody in the family. It can't be done.
yeah, yeah. It's hard. And I'll say this one thing. One of the things that my best friend and we related um on is she was the rock of her family and I was the rock of my family.
Mhm.
And or have had to play that role for such a long time. I remember Mary saying that earlier as well. And it's a tough, in fact, it was so tough that I even had to separate myself from her family, because I had such a fear of, I'm going to be called on to be available, and I'm still grieving myself. I'm still going through,
Yes,
my own hurt and pain.
yes. And that was probably a wise move to make.
I
Now
think
you may be able to reestablish some connection with them, or maybe you did at some point in the future. But to take on that responsibility from the very beginning when you are grieving yourself um, would probably not do them a good service anyway. You probably would not have been able to be the rock that they might have wanted you to be.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think sometimes too, because I'm required to be the rock and the go-to person, I resent that because nobody ever asks me, how do I feel? I come across as probably being strong, and I don't, um, I'm not emotional about people dying or my family member that have lost, but they expect for me to hold up the flag or the post, and I sometimes I really resent that. Sometimes
Yeah,
I even feel like I'm not even loved or cared for, you know.
they
And
want me to do all the loving,
right, right,
but they're
Yes,
not loving me back.
right.
same
So
here. Yep.
Yes.
yeah, so I just rely on my faith. I really, really, really wrap myself around the scriptures and realize that God is the only one that can carry anybody, and He actually carries me so that I can carry them occasionally. But I don't put myself out, and I'm very fortunate that I live in Texas and they live in Illinois, and very, very fortunate. There's caller ID. I don't even have to answer the phone, so
Yeah.
that is a blessing.
That is a blessing. That is a
Yes, it
blessing.
is. But Mary, something that you said there, and I think of Marissa on that too, is that God is the rock. And that's how we should express something like that, is to tell them God is the rock. I can be a support, but I cannot be the rock. That is only Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, Mary, that was a very good insight. I love that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, another point, but my family, they'll say things like, and they haven't gone to church in years. I don't think he was saved, the way he lived his life. And my comment is nobody knows that. That's between that person and God. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he didn't make it to heaven. And I'm thinking to myself, talking about calling the cattle black, man, you're making
Yes,
these statements about this individual. You haven't been in church in years, but I don't comment on it because it just causes confusion. And my
right.
only comment is that nobody can answer that question. That's between them and God.
Yes. If it were not for God's grace, none of us
Right.
would be able to be there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in conclusion, as we wrap this up for tonight, um, as you're helping these families out, it's important to get to know the culture of the family that you're attempting to help. If you're of a different cultural background, then talk to others that are of the background of the person you're trying to help, and try to learn some of the distinctions of that culture. Um, each culture that we come in contact with has kind of a different way of grief and expressing grief, um, and how they react at a time of death and how they grieve. And so it's important to understand that too. But it's also important to understand the culture of the family and how they're made up too, because even families of the same ethnic culture can grieve in very different ways, and the culture of their own family can be different too. We're not all the same, and we shouldn't expect that everyone relates in the same way as well. Listen to each family member and find out what they know, what they imagine, what they fear, what they feel. And don't assume that you understand the terms that they might use either. Ask them questions, clarify their answers, understand where they're coming from, and what their feelings and their hurts are at that moment. And remember that the more verbal ones in the family may try to dominate and may try to take up all of the time and the attention. But the quiet ones in the family have just as much to contribute and just as many needs as those more outwardly verbal, sometimes perhaps even more. And so encourage their involvement in conversation too. If you see someone who is being ignored or who is being overlooked during the grief, make it a point to talk to them, to go over and engage them, to say hello, and to ask them how they're feeling, ask them what they're feeling, and just show them some empathy too, and help them to be drawn out a little bit and to share some of their grief as well. If you're involved with a family prior to the death of a loved one, discuss their fears and concerns too, about death, as well as what it's like to be around someone who's dying. This is something that I deal with all the time because I work in hospice. And so I am many times explaining to people what it's like at the time of death, and what it's like to be around a dying person. Even the children need help processing through things like that too. Be aware, though, that there may be people, relatives, or friends that the family sometimes would rather not have visiting. We've had to deal with this too in many cases, where we as chaplains and social workers have to step into a family situation and keep some family members from coming in because it's too toxic an environment for them to come into, or they bring too much toxicity into the family unit as well. So sometimes that happens too, and it's regrettable, but families are families and they're not perfect. There's lots of dynamics in some families that you have to deal with as well. But help the family members know how to respond to the dying person. Help them to know how to talk to them. Encourage them to let that person know how much they're loved, what they've meant to them, and how they'll be remembered. There's nothing at all wrong with talking to them about things like that. And to those in the family that are providing the care, remember, caregiving can be a very draining experience, emotionally and physically. And they need to anticipate how that experience will stretch their coping skills. Those of you who have been caregivers to someone who has been sick know how difficult it is. Help them develop a plan to maintain their stamina and their energy levels. Parents who are losing a spouse and still have to care for young children are especially vulnerable and are going to need lots of help. And hopefully the churches that we attend can step up and provide some of that help too as the family goes through this thing. But help them also to retain a sense of optimism. Even though the person is dying, how can they make the most of this time that they have left together? How can they get through this together? And let me make one last suggestion before we close out. And that's about you. As a person who is ministering to either the dying or to the grieving, you are going to be impacted too by what you hear and see. And it's important for you to express your own grief and your own feelings about that too, about what you're experiencing as you help others. This is something that I go through a lot. I have a fellow chaplain, and he and I talk. I have social workers that I work with, and they are Christian people, and we are able to share with one another as we go through this too. It's very important for all of us as we minister to others to remember that we too are suffering with them in this grief, even though we're there to help them. It may be important for us to talk to someone that we trust, or to write out our experiences. We need others in our lives too, to effectively minister to these people that are grieving. So don't ever forget that too. God bless you all. I'll see you next week, and we'll get together again and have another discussion next week too.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Good night, Les.
Bless you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.